Please, Madam.
Chairman, members of the committees, esteemed members of Parliament, ladies and gentlemen. A few days ago, the murder of Alexei Navalny shocked the world. To the world, this was yet another demonstration of the nature of the Putin regime. To the Russian population, to Russian civil society, this was a personal pain, a devastating blow. We lost yet another fierce warrior for a different future for our country, a future that we can see, that we can envisage, a future that he symbolized. We lost one of the best, one of the most principled, strong fighters, and also one who gave us hope, all of us. He is not the only one. Alexei is not the only one who carries that hope. But he was a fierce warrior, and we lost him. And now we will need to work even harder, so much harder, to achieve the goals that we have set. In her 2022 report on the situation with human rights in Russia, OSCE rapporteur Professor Nussberger pointed out that repression on the inside and the war on the outside are connected to each other, as if in a communicating tube. Today, according to Memorial, the conservative number of political prisoners in the Russian Federation approaches 700 people. And according to OVD Info, over 20,000 people illegally, unlawfully detained since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine had broken out. There were, in 2022 alone, there were at least 565 minors. And criminal proceedings were initiated against at least 9 of them before they reached the age of 18, including against 16-year-old Nikita Uvarov, who was sentenced to 5 years in prison for planning to blow up an FSB building, a virtual FSB building in the computer game Minecraft. OVD Info reports that in 2023 alone, at least 50 people died in detention or during arrests. And the circumstances of the death of these people are quite unclear. The regime has brought back the entire arsenal of Soviet-style repressive instruments, including torture, punitive psychiatry, sexual and physical abuse, and Stalin-era prison terms of 10, 15, 25 years to eradicate dissent and scare people into silence. Political assassination is not a new thing for us. Anna Politkovskaya, a journalist with Novaya Gazeta, was assassinated in 2006. Novaya Gazeta alone lost 6 employees to political assassinations over the years. A leader of the Russian opposition, Boris Nemtsov, was gunned down in front of the Kremlin walls in 2015. Alexei Navalny survived a poisoning attack on him before the regime threw him in prison, tortured him for 3 years, and actually succeeded in killing him. My husband, who survived 2 assassination attacks on him in 2015 and 2017, is still there, behind bars, still alive for now, sentenced to 25 years of strict regime for consistently opposing the regime of Vladimir Putin, for calling the war against Ukraine a crime that needed to be prosecuted, for calling for a Nuremberg-style tribunal for those responsible for that crime of aggression and war crimes committed there. All this is happening in the atmosphere of total censorship and propaganda used by the regime to create a warped Soviet-style image of reality in which the entire population stands behind Putin and his war and aggression of Ukraine. Meanwhile, hundreds of people got arrested over the last few days for just laying flowers to commemorate Alexei Navalny. In view of all of this, I believe it is important to reiterate a few messages. With all independent media banned and blocked, civil society institutions destroyed, and international observers and rapporteurs consistently denied entry to the country, we have only a vague idea of the scale of repression that is happening in Russia. This is why it is crucially important to support, including financially, the work of those independent journalists, civil society groups, and lawyers who do their best to monitor this situation and report on it against all odds. Second, in October of last year, the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe adopted the report by Rapporteur Peter Onzik on the illegitimacy of Vladimir Putin's regime, and the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe adopted a resolution calling on all member states to not recognize the legitimacy of Vladimir Putin as a head of state after this year's sham election. There are very clear legal justifications for this step. The constitutional amendments carried out in 2022 in Russia through a fraudulent referendum that basically destroyed the country's fundamental law and made Vladimir Putin into a czar, are not legitimate, both from the point of view of the Russian constitution and from the point of view of international norms, as repeatedly pointed out by the European Parliament and the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe. Not to mention the fact that this so-called election will be carried out on the occupied Ukrainian territories, where people are forced to accept Russian citizenship in exchange for humanitarian aid or medication. I urge you to respond to this call and send a clear message to the Kremlin that Vladimir Putin is a criminal wanted by the ICC and not a legitimate president or a partner on the international stage. Now, the crisis of hostage-taking and imprisoning people for their beliefs or their political views is on the rise worldwide. This comes as a result of impunity that autocrats were allowed to enjoy during a prolonged period of time, almost a quarter of a century in the case of Vladimir Putin, which means that after years and sometimes even decades of ignoring or appeasing a monster, the free world is faced with the need to control the damage, a process that is accompanied by all these ethical dilemmas about giving in to terrorists, dilemmas that could have been avoided had the regime or the terrorist organization been prevented from growing into a monster in the first place. I urge you to respond more responsibly to the rising crisis of hostage-taking and political imprisonment and stand with those political prisoners, specifically in the Russian Federation, but also in Belarus, who are suffering tremendously from the regimes in these countries, for standing up to them and for wanting a different future for their countries. There are people you can save. Do what you can to save them so that they could be there tomorrow to rebuild these countries from scratch and make them into democracies. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Kara-Murza. And now I give the floor to Vladimir Milov, also for 7 minutes.